These photographs are among the earliest attempts of the camera to document a social problem. They were taken by Hugh Diamond, a photographer and doctor in charge of an asylum. The subjects were thought to be mad. Traditionally, artists expressed themselves through their materials. Photography invited a more scientific approach, a chance at last to show the true aspect of madness. The madhouse of old London was called Bedlam, and it was quite frank about its purpose. Stuck right up above the front door were these two figures. This is raving and melancholy madness. Now, over the centuries, Bedlam got itself a fearful reputation, and deservedly so. In more brutal times, the madhouse was a human zoo where society ladies came for amusement. The painter Hogarth modelled his main characters on the two old statues above the door of Bedlam. But the Victorians were great reformers, so they discreetly retired raving and melancholy here to what's now the Victoria and Albert Museum. And they also made some effort to introduce more humane and scientific treatment. So mental illness became one of the first social problems to be brought before the camera, not out of any sense of liberal indignation, more a matter of cold, scientific curiosity. These pictures carry the imprint of a professional, Henry Herring, a photographer from Regent Street in London. Others attribute them to Dr. Diamond, who said that photographs of the mentally ill would exhibit to the eye the well-known sympathy which exists between the diseased brain and the features of the body. In other words, the illness would show in the face. But too much was claimed for photography by its enthusiasts. These portraits, which attempt to show patients before and after their cure, could carry an infinity of associations. They need words to give them meaning. Some institutions did combine words and pictures in ways which hint at the sadness and obsession of the times. James Pickering, blacksmith. Problem, melancholia. Cause, trouble. Henry Eastland, draper's assistant. Mania. Cause, masturbation. Hannah Marriage, mania. Cause, love. Jemima Mills, mania. Cause, ill treatment. Kate Trait, congenital. Edward Joseph Norton, revivalism. Charlotte Wales, cause unknown. This asylum was built in Paris in the 1850s, not as an asylum for the insane, but as a rest home for sick workers. The early camera didn't go out of its way to show how the other half lived, but in this case, there was something to celebrate: state charity. The set of pictures taken by Charles Nègre were commissioned by the founder of the hospital, the Emperor of France, as photographic proof of his good works. The whole asylum was centrally heated and could cope with 6,000 patients a year. It had laundries which put fresh linen on soft beds and a free health service. In the English asylum, photography had been a pseudoscience, but in France, it was used more shrewdly for social propaganda. The failure of early photographers to expose more of the real squalor of life can be explained in part by the cumbersome and still primitive process. In the 1850s, the life of the London poor had been investigated by a great social reporter, Henry Mayhew, who took along a photographer, but the photographs had to be engraved before they could be published, and that robbed them of authenticity and the power to move. 20 years later, in the footsteps of Mayhew came John Thomson, a Scotsman who had previously done remarkable documentary work in the Far East. In 1877, Thomson illustrated a book written by a journalist, Street Life in London. And while Thomson's photographs reflect the surface of life, it's the facts supplied by the journalist which complete the picture. At one level, this photograph simply shows a group of Cockneys outside an East End pub. But the text explains that the man on the right is called Hookie Alf because he lost his arm in an accident at work. A previous accident had left him epileptic. He and his family were now destitute. Alf kept them alive by selling matches. Reformers made more effective propaganda with cautionary tales like this one on the dangers of drink by Cruikshank. These photographs were taken in Liverpool in 1892 by Charles Inston using the new detector for a hand camera. They were tinted and used to illustrate a lantern slide lecture called Slum Life in Our Great Cities. One great problem was drunkenness. The temperance movement was strong, and photographs were used by the League for the Prohibition of the Sale of Intoxicating Liquor to Children. The League's photographs show children carrying drink home to their parents. In fact, Victorian Britain was reckoned by some to be the most drunken country in the world. The Liverpool lecture notes complain of widespread poverty, violence, and homelessness. In Victorian times, thousands of abandoned children slept rough in the streets of London. When Thomas Bernardo, a missionary on his way to teach Christianity to the Chinese, saw the street children, he decided that his real mission was among the London poor. Bernardo was one of the first to use photography to dramatize social problems. Photographers working for Bernardo took tens of thousands of pictures of the children brought in from the streets. Bernardo used the before and after technique to advertise his success. This pair was captioned, "Before, craving for admission. After, desires fully gratified." Cards like these were used to raise money for the homes. But Bernardo then had to defend himself against the charge of misconduct in his photo propaganda. A rival reformer alleged, "Bernardo's method is to take the children as they are supposed to enter the home, and then after they have been in the home for some time. He is not satisfied with taking them as they really are, but he tears their clothes so as to make them appear worse than they really are." It was argued that Katie Smith, one of the favorite models, had never been a match seller as the picture implied. And Bernardo was judged guilty of artistic fiction. After that scare, his photographers stuck largely to straight mugshots for the record. When a London barrister called Arthur Munby strolled through St James's Park on the 15th of July, 1864, he saw at first hand the casualties of Victorian London. And according to his diary, on this one path, there were 109 derelicts in the grass between the lake and the mall. And a park keeper told him, they are men out of work, and the unfortunate girls, servant girls many of them, what has been out of place and took to the streets, till they've sunk so low that they can't get a living even by prostitution. Class was then a most powerful taboo, and Munby was a victim of it. He fell in love with a servant girl, married her in secret, and then spent the rest of his life leading a double life. So, when his papers were opened 40 years after his death, he was revealed as a gentleman obsessed by lower-class women and their work.
Munby didn't take the pictures himself. He paid the women to pose in studios. He became a virtual one-man commission on the condition of working women, and the women coal miners of Wigan were a special attraction. Munby was dismayed when reformers stopped women working underground, an act he judged to be blatant discrimination. He even had Hannah Munby photographed in her two roles, as humble servant and secret wife. Near the end of the century, a young photographer from Leicester, Sidney Newton, thoroughly documented one aspect of industrial life, the construction of the last major railway line in Britain. Most photographs of men at work in the 19th century were taken out of doors for obvious reasons. Mines and factories were too dark, or simply out of bounds to inquisitive cameras. For all their concern with working conditions, socialists and early trade unionists never managed to recruit the camera to their cause. Social significance can be read into pictures like these today, but they were commissioned by the railway company, and their documentary content came from the quite apolitical enthusiasm of Newton. He took nearly 1,000 photographs of the men who built the railway from Leicester to London. The bands of navvies who followed the tracks lived rough, and their reputation for wild living attracted the evangelists. Little wonder the British worker owes more to Methodism than to Marxism. There is also a clear social division between the men who built the railways and those who ran them. The upper working class, who were the shining core of the British labour movement, seemed to display the same rectitude and respectability as the Victorian middle class. The enduring hardship was on the land. A French historian travelling through Britain observed that the farm workers he saw were drawn, strained, sad and humble. And the farm women, he said, had haggard faces, blotchily red, and a wasted, exhausted look. These photographs were taken for sale to the public by George Washington Wilson of Aberdeen, who made photographic views into a profitable business. Most of Wilson's views are conventionally romantic, and he was also photographer royal to Victoria in Scotland, where he took many views of the Queen. her Highland estates, and her staff at work. Again, the photographs are mute, but by chance rather than design, Wilson's vast collection can offer a glimpse of the bleak rural life of Scotland 100 years ago. The land was so barren that those in the Highlands not forced out by the landowners often abandoned their crofts anyway and crowded into the slums of cities like Glasgow. By the 1850s, cholera killed 100 out of every 1,000 Glaswegians, and something, it was agreed, had to be done about the cold stone tenements. But first, the City Improvement Trust called in a photographer to make a record of the old Glasgow. He was an architectural photographer, a superb technician called Thomas Annan. This is his study of the High Street in Glasgow in 1868. The main street of Gorbals in 1868. A residential close off the High Street in Glasgow.
Pictures were taken in 1868. The worst slums were already condemned and about to be cleared. And incidentally, they're now pulling down the slums that replaced those slums. But Thomas Annan, who took the pictures, wasn't interested in exposing or campaigning. He was simply commissioned to record all this picturesque squalor before it disappeared forever. And he did it like the artist he was.
As you can see from his photographs, the buildings command Annan's eye. The people stand around, dominated by the buildings, looking wretched and quite incidental. While conditions for most people were miserable, photographers in 19th century Europe lacked the awareness or the indignation which might have turned the camera into a weapon of journalistic investigation or social reform. The reforming camera was to come of age in a country with a more robust and democratic tradition, the United States of America.
It's significant that the camera in New York was not in the hands of some middle-class gentleman with a taste for the curious, as it had been almost exclusively in Britain. The campaigning cameraman here had been a down-and-out immigrant himself. He came from Denmark, and his name was Jacob Riis. Because of his revelations, some of the worst slums around here in the 1880s were pulled down to make way for what were then new tenements and for this park. Riis was the first of a breed which flourished best in America. Committed, muckraking journalists who knew when to use a camera where words would fail. So Reese's camera was used not just to document, but for the first time to get things done.
And there was much to be done. After the waves of Irish and Germans in mid-century had come the Italians, the Poles, and the Jews. By the 1880s, the Lower East Side of New York was the most overcrowded slum in the world. Jacob Riis had suffered in these slums. Now, as a journalist, he was determined to expose the scandal through words and pictures. When he couldn't find a photographer bold enough to help, Riis simply went out and took his own pictures. The raw quality communicates some of Riis's passion about the lodging houses, the sweatshops, the banditry and the overcrowding. Riis whipped up public indignation. He was unashamedly political, and his camera became an ally in his crusades. Riis's newspaper carried his articles, but his photographs could only appear as engravings. Riis made his photographs into lantern slides and then used them as visual evidence at public rallies. Others were published in a best-selling book called How the Other Half Lives. Riis's photographs forced the authorities to clear the worst dives and lodging houses. He saw the notorious Mulberry Bend area eventually demolished and replaced by a park in the 1890s. But Riis's muckraking was obviously resented. The politicians refused to invite him to the opening of the park. Riis's park at Mulberry Bend is still there today, busy with new generations of immigrants. Although old photographs allow us to see something of the reality of life in the last century, this park remains one of the few tangible achievements of the camera as a tool of social reform in the first 60 years of photography.
In the next episode of Camera, Mirror Image, Gus MacDonald introduces the great Victorian photographers who provided people with what they wanted most, portraits of themselves, of family and of friends. Victorian ladies who wanted a flattering image were told to say prunes.